I would like to thank all former prime ministers for serving their country for the mandate in which they were chosen. All of them, including this current prime minister, has done a remarkable job for what they were called to do. But it is a new day dawning in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. I'd like to preface my presentation by quoting Mr. Nathan Rothschild, who said, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not what laws they make. I care not what puppet is placed on the throne. The man that controls the money controls the empire." In 1965, Sir Lyndon Oscar Pinling traveled to the United Nations to address the Special Committee on Decolonization August 23rd and 24th. This lays the foundation for our forum today, and we term it the case for replacing the Westminster system of government in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Along with Sir Lyndon went Mr. Clarence A. Bain, Mr. Cecil Wallace Whitfield, Sir Milo Butler, Mr. Arthur D. Hanna, Mr. Arthur Folks, Dr. Doris Johnson, and Dr. Herbert W. Brown. Sir Lyndon said, "Mr. Chairman, all ministers in the Bahamian cabinet are Bahamian born, with the exception of one who is granted a special status roughly equivalent to that of being Bahamian born. They all belong to the merchant oligarchy, which has been in control since 1729 and of European extraction. Ministers own large blocks of shares in the majority of local enterprises and benefit from government contracts, or with the tacit approval of the United Kingdom government. For example, Sir Roland Simonet, the Prime Minister, is perhaps the biggest road builder in the country. The Minister of Maritime Affairs is a major supplier of lumber and hardware goods to the government and perhaps the biggest ship owner in the country. The Minister of Agriculture has large farming interests and supplies air conditioning materials to the government, as does the Minister of Electricity. The Minister of Finance and Tourism is the head of a food chain, an insurance company, a law firm, which often represents his ministry and his clients at the same time. That state of affairs has always existed. Before ministerial government was introduced, executive government was shared by public boards whose chairman and members acted in the same manner as the present ministers. At the time of the 1963 Constitutional Conference, the point was raised by both the representatives of the Progressive Liberal Party and the Labour Party. The United Kingdom representatives were appraised of the situation, and although they agreed that such conduct was not entirely satisfactory, they still considered that in the circumstances it might be advisable for them to leave things as they are. The matter of conflict of interest was also discussed in great detail in the House of Assembly after ministerial government was introduced in great detail in the House of Assembly after ministerial government was introduced in January 1964. No action was taken. Sir Lyndon said every single minister of the government engages in business and receives lucrative government contracts at the same time. The United Kingdom is aware of this, he said, and the fact that because of such a system, it is easy to imagine the abuse and corruption to which it might give rise. Yet nothing has been done. He indicated that while the ruling group is accumulating great wealth, it is also maintaining an iniquitous method of taxation, and the wealthy are by no means bearing their fair share of the tax burden. The overall picture of the present situation in the Bahamas is that the country is literally, economically, and financially in the very same hand that has and has exercised political control. Moreover, for 3 centuries, the British have never introduced any development plan for the islands to improve the situation of the people, both socially and or economically. And we are now paying for centuries of neglect in those circumstances. We are convinced that the opposition can no longer fulfill its functions. It cannot lend itself to what is in fact nothing more than a dictatorship disguised in a democracy. In the not too distant future, the Commonwealth of the Bahamas will be embarking on 50 years of independence as we enter our Jubilee. The Westminster model, as a part of a larger independence pact, was designed to maintain the status quo in the English-speaking Caribbean. It is responsible for the major challenges facing the Bahamas today. We, therefore, of the Kingdom Government Movement, advocate for a broader conceptualization of sovereignty and call for the invention of a new democracy. The politics of colonialism is the politics of exclusion. The politics of independence would be the politics of participation, and this has nothing to do with the Westminster model of government. I'd like to introduce to you the Independence Pact. In my reading, Westminster was an element in a package. The Independence Pact in the British Caribbean. That pact was not about independence. It was about the preservation of the status quo. Its essentials were, first, the entrenchment of property rights in the Constitution. Second, the entrenchment of the two-party system. Third, the preservation of the laws, institutions, and symbols of the colonial state. And fourth, an alliance with the Western powers in the Cold War. I will illustrate this by sharing some factual recollections and observations. Though the father of our nation was advised against the retention of the monarchy, he declined to do so in order to appease the select few that were residing in Abaco who sought to bear arms that were not interested in becoming independent. So Lyndon was advised, on the contrary, not to accept the monarchy because it would lead to psychological necessities. It would be contrary to the psychological necessities of nation building that the Queen of England would be the head of state of an independent Bahamas. It appeared at the time that it would be an excellent idea, but it connoted continuity rather than rupture. And I would argue that it has institutionalized a fractured psyche of political allegiance among those who were to be responsible for the running of the affairs of our country. What does it do to the state of mind of the Governor General, the Prime Minister, ministers of the government, parliamentary secretaries, members of Parliament, and the judiciary, when as a condition of assuming and holding office, each is required to take an oath to be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors, according to law. This feature of the Constitution confers upon our political leaders a cynical betrayal of the masses. We declare that we have been brainwashed in the British culture. This template of the Constitution was, I presume, supplied by the Colonial Office. The details were negotiated by a joint select committee of the House of Assembly of the Bahamas and the two major political parties at the time. It is structured in such a way that the two are virtually guaranteed an indefinite duopoly of political power. It is almost impossible to change the Constitution without the agreement of both parties. The implanting of the colonial ways of thinking into the native elites was one of the outstanding successes of the British policy throughout the entire English-speaking Caribbean. It was key to the entrenchment of the Westminster system of government in the soon-to-be independent Bahamas. Reading the Constitution of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas today is a surreal experience. There is a great difficulty in thinking it has anything to do with an independent Bahamas. The document is actually a royal order in council. You will not find anything in it remotely like the reference to the sovereignty of the people. The final judiciary authority, including on matters concerning the interpretation of the Constitution itself, is the British Privy Council. The Independence Pact was made between the British and the Bahamian political and elite classes that had emerged. The Bahamians would exercise formal political authority. The economy would remain in the hands of the foreign firms and the local oligarchy. American, British, and Canadian firms were to be entrenched in banking and finance, while local landowners and merchants controlled the best land, tourism, and import trading. A key element would be a security apparatus with close links to the imperialist system. And looking back over the past 50 years, we see both continuity and change. At one level, the colonialist strategy succeeded very well. The population has been diverted from any agenda of revolutionary transformation. Politics is a perpetual game of alternating ins and outs, and winner takes all. It is characterized mainly by mudslinging, sensationalism, and the pursuit of trivia. Every 5 years, a cornucopia of election campaign promises is routinely made. Few are kept. People participation is limited to chairing at election rallies and a 10-second act of voting every 5 years. Government is reduced to prime ministerial dictatorship. Long-term issues of development are hardly ever on the agenda of popular political discourse. I find it fascinating that since 1729, nothing has changed. We must be mindful that Sir Lyndon had an opportunity to change and not accept the monarchy, where he complained about the very thing that confronts us today. And ladies and gentlemen, this is why the Commonwealth of the Bahamas is in the state that it's in today. And you can look around you and see who controls the same areas that the Independence Pact spoke about all the way back in the early 60s and 70s. Nothing has changed. I submit to you that since gaining independence from the United Kingdom, 1962 to 1980, many of the English-speaking islands in the Caribbean, specifically the 12 nations that form the Caribbean community, which is known as CARICOM, adopted the British Westminster form of government. Nevertheless, independence for these former British colonies was not truly about independence. Independence was about the entrenchment of the two-party system and the preservation of laws, institutions, and symbols of the colonial state. These former colonies are now members of the British Commonwealth of Nations. As the head of the ruling party, the Prime Minister and his cabinet of ministers are the government. The region is now over 50 years removed from its marches of independence. However, little is left of the original Westminster model, except the surreal altercation of the original model. Globalization has also led to departures of the original intent of the model. It also created circumstances that have led to worsening conditions for the people, widespread government corruption, and the raiding of the general funds by office holders and their cohorts, a lack of transparency, the huge effects of invisible money donations in political campaigns, the literally unchecked powers of the executive, and weaknesses that lack power of the influence of local government. Independence in the Commonwealth Caribbean saw the birth of a two-party system that took hold and became so ingrained in these new societies that some of its citizens placed party affiliation above love of country. What was so striking was how the Westminster model maintained the laws, the foundations, and symbols of colonialism. My fellow Bahamians, we are in crisis, with no relief in sight. It is the mandate of those that perpetuate the Westminster system to continue in this path until the end of time. We are therefore still subjects, We're not an independent and a sovereign nation, as was proclaimed in 1973. Make no mistake about it. Our Bahamas is in the throes of the greatest crisis since independence. The specter of evolving into a failed society is no longer a subject of imagination. How our country will crawl out of this vicious vortex of persistent low growth, crippling debt, huge fiscal deficits, and high unemployment, no diversification of the economy, is the single most important question facing us at this time. Our beloved Bahamas is in a state of crisis. Our post-colonial state has collapsed. There is a feeling of lost hope. This is not what our forefathers fought and died for. A state of crisis manifesting itself in various forms. The system of governance has failed. The system of Westminster has failed the people and the citizenry of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Economic realities have turned national sovereignty into an illusion, a legal formality that is increasingly devoid of substance. We have not managed our sovereignty well, and the first requirement of sovereignty is the ability to manage your own affairs and pay your way in the world, and we haven't done that well. So moving forward, Bahamas, can the national project be rescued? What is the meaning of sovereignty to countries like ours in the new global order? And where does the Westminster system fit into all of this? Terms such as food sovereignty, energy independence, the endogenous capacity to manage and adapt to climate change, the capacity to secure your borders and your people, the ability to speak knowledgeably and convincingly in global flora, and to be taken seriously. Above all, sovereignty means the capacity of a society and its citizens to think for themselves. It begins in the mind. I submit to you today that Westminster did not begin in England. Westminster began in Rome. And what egregious crime that has been perpetrated on the entire English-speaking Caribbean nations. It is a sad affair. Our whole mindset needs, therefore, to change. We need to see ourselves now as owners and possessors of this great land that we were given to inherit. For hardly anything belongs to us as Bahamians. The colonial system has existed in the Bahamas for over 300 years and is still very much intact. Either the colonial system must go or democracy must go, because we are not democratic. The voice of the Bahamian citizens is only heard once in every 5 years, is at the polls. The voice of the opposition is never heard. There has not been one occasion where the royal opposition has influenced the governing party so that they would change a policy. And you must remember that in the Independence Pact, it's winner takes all. The opposition only grandstands. Whether the governing party has one constituency ahead, one member, still they have the majority. And in the Westminster system, the Prime Minister has prime ministerial dictatorship. So my fellow Bahamians, it matters not how you march, it matters not how you agitate, it matters not how upset you become on any government policy. I submit to you that the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas of the day will carry out its mandate with or without your approval. It will carry out its mandate with or without the sanction of the royal opposition. We must be mindful that both the governing party and the royal opposition belongs to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. So while the mind game continues to be played with the citizens of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, our children are being deprived of their inheritance. Our country is in a state of failure. There's never been a diversification of our economy. We are still in the same situation that we were in from the days of the former government, the UBP. Nothing has changed. But we of this new Joshua generation possesses more creativity, ingenuity, tech savvy, and the skill in every sector of our society, more so than any time in our nation's history, prior to and after independence. And I invite you to come along with us on this journey to build a new and better Bahamas, for the time is now. We ask you to be the voice of change and a paradigm of progress. We are therefore moving forward, upward, onward together on a path to a purity of purpose. We present before you today the Kingdom Government Movement. Thank you very much.